Sunday, June the 21st, and my name is SILVIA NADJIVAN. I'm Deputy Managing Director of the Institute for the Danube Region and Central Europe, IDM, and IDM is organizing this event together with the Political Academy and the Karl-Renner-Institut. It's a format, panel discussions to parliamentary elections in our focus region, which exists for several years. However, this time, due to the COVID-19 pandemic and necessary regulations, we started this panel discussion as a live stream format, an online one. And I appreciate, first of all, to give the floor to Ambassador Klaus WÖLFER, who is head of the Department of Southeast Europe and EU Enlargement and Deputy Political Director at the Austrian Federal Ministry for Europe Integration and Foreign Affairs. And a part of that, he's also a member of the IDM board in Vienna. So many thanks for joining us.
Thank you, NADJIVAN. Hello to everybody. I hope you can hear me. It was quite an effort to get connected, but I think this is a good omen. And if you can hear me now, I'm really deeply satisfied and we have already achieved something. So hello here from the Austrian Foreign Ministry in Vienna. Thank you all listening and watching for the interest in the subject. I'm really happy to be here also on behalf of the IDM, Institut für Donauraum und Mitteleuropa, who I think have chosen a very pertinent subject at the right time. Now, one could argue that at elections in Serbia, what can be expected? We know who the winner will be. It is not a very exciting thing. Why should we lose too much time and effort on it? But I think there are excellent reasons to argue to the contrary. In fact, it is not only is Serbia the biggest of the Western Balkan countries, but also the elections take place in a particular moment where things are really to get moving again after years of stagnation, maybe. There are elections that are particular in many ways. As I mentioned, there will be, we can already expect the result by and large, but however, it will be important to gauge the degree of abstention, given that the opposition, or part of the opposition, have called for a boycott of the elections. So that is a thing to watch. And like every election, it is a way to take the pulse of a nation, of a country. And for that reason, it is particularly relevant in this moment where the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue is about to hopefully take steam again. European Union Special Envoy Milorad Lajčák, he is currently in Pristina. He intends to be in Belgrade very soon. There is this invitation by the US government, US White House, for leaders of the two countries, Belgrade and Pristina, to come to Washington to discuss things. So all this is to be scheduled, is scheduled within the next, 10 days. So it is really a very exciting moment. There is 28th of June looming, the famous day of St. Veit, as we say, Vidovdan, a date which is very heavily loaded in history and memories, expectations in the entire area in Southeast Europe and in Serbia in particular. So I think there is really a lot to discuss, and there is a fine circle of invitees here today who are very well placed to help us understand better the whole situation. I understand it will be Dr. NADJIVAN who will introduce the speakers, whom I all hold in high esteem. And I wish this conversation and this discussion success, enlightenment to us, and a tiny contribution to making things better in Southeast Europe. Thank you, and hello from Vienna.
So many thanks, Ambassador WÖLFER. Before we enter our panel discussion with our guests, I would like to give some words on the current situation in Serbia. Serbia is the first country that is now taken for the parliamentary elections. So after the COVID-19 pandemic and necessary regulations, Serbia is now the first country where these parliamentary elections will take place. And it's also interesting to see, against the background of the election of 2016, which parties might have a good chance to enter the parliament. When we take a look at the graphic of the parliamentary elections of 2016, we can see that the SNS, headed by, in fact, Aleksandar Vučić, the Progressive Party, is the most prominent one. Is also expected that it might also increase its share. And apart from the SNS, also the Socialist Party under Ivica Dačić has good chances to enter and to increase its mandate. And also now for 2020, the Radical Party, Serbian Radical Party, might also play a big role in the results of the 2020 elections. And when we take a look at the 2016 election results, we can see that we have an overestimating dominance of the SNS, and then all other parties are here to see. And when we go to Serbian parliamentary elections at the moment, we have a specific situation, the pandemic 19, the COVID-19 pandemic, global, which is a global problem, global crisis. And of course, Serbia, as many other states in Europe and abroad, faced a lockdown. And what is interesting about Serbia is the way the lockdown was declared and realized, because it would be, according to the Serbian constitutional framework, it would be adequate to use the national protocol for the case of catastrophes such as earthquakes, floods, and pandemic. But instead of that, the state of emergency was declared, and the state of emergency is only declared by constitutional law when a state and danger exists, such as violent uprisings or war. And in a way, with this emergency state, we have another context than just using the national protocol for case of catastrophes. And these regulations and the situation of the lockdown, which started on March 15 and ended in May the 6th, also deepened the already existing deep polarization among the Serbian society and among the approximately 6.7 officially registered voters in Serbia. And in general, we could see two main blocks among the Serbian voters. On the one hand, the absolute supporters of the government headed by the Prime Minister Ana Brnabić and influenced by the Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić. And on the other hand, the vicious critiques and opponents who first of all criticize the questionable implementation of the curfew and the growing dissatisfaction among the population, mostly also living in towns and in fact quarantined in their flats. And this deep division and polarization also revolves around the question of a possible election boycott in a country where the average voter turnout in the last years was about already 53%. The last election turnout, 2016, was about 56%. And despite many attempts, even by the European Union, to moderate between the government and the opposition, the boycott is still ongoing. And interestingly, an interesting detail is also that Donald Tusk wish the Serbian president, Aleksandar Vučić, good luck for the coming parliamentary elections. But not only the division among the government and the opposition can be realized, also the opposition itself is deeply divided. We have also 20 election and coalition parties coalitions, and main blocks we could see at first of all the Alliance for Serbia, which was founded by major opposition parties such as the Democratic Party, the Party for Freedom and Justice, the Social Democratic Party, and the People's Party, and even Dveri, so hard nationalistic party, and they share since their foundation in 2018 a common goal, namely the removal of the current SNS government, and also they're getting out of the marginalized public position. But although they share this common goal, they do not succeed in overcoming their political and ideological differences, and also their relations, which is of course, according to the different ideological backgrounds, antagonistic. And the second group within the opposition, influential group, is the Movement for Free Citizens, which was founded in the course of the citizens' protests in 2019. It is headed by the well-known actor Sergei Trifunovic, who on the one hand criticizes the government, but also the parliamentary opposition. And he, as well as other parties, such as the Alliance for Serbia, do boycott the elections. So, and apart from this elections boycott, we also have a new removal, a new reform, because the Prime Minister Ana Brnabić declared that the census from 5 to 3% for entering the parliament will be decreased, so from 5% to 3%, with the explanation that also small parties should have the chance to enter the parliament and be influential. And as we see, we have the election boycott, we have a new political legal reform in Serbia, which leads us to a situation where we in fact cannot really estimate the results, the coming election results, and this is great for discussing today. And I would just like to give you a short overview of the parties, which are the candidates. We have, all in all, we have 20 parties for the elections, and then we have here those parties who do boycott the parliamentary elections to hinder the results. And of course, this is a further element just to polarize the political discourse and the political debates. So we have also the possibility as a live stream panel discussion to collect the questions and comments of the participants herein, of our viewers. So as an information for you, I would like to lead your attention to the possibility that you can, during our discussion, you can click on two buttons, on one question mark and one statement symbol, for posing questions, which we will collect and will give them answers to them at the end of the panel discussion. So now I would like to introduce our guests. It's a great honor to have the possibility to talk to experts and to share their knowledge and their experience within this online panel discussion. I would like to introduce now Florian BIEBER, who is a professor and director of the Center for Southeastern European Studies, and he also holds the Jean Monnet Chair in Europeanization of Southeastern Europe at the University of Graz. So Many thanks for joining us, Florian.
Thank you.
Our next guest is ALEKSANDRA VIDANOVIĆ, who is expert on human rights and independent advisor trainer at the Council of Europe and Olof Palme Center in Belgrade. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And our third guest is Professor Jovan TEOKAREVIĆ, who is Professor of Comparative Politics at the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Belgrade, and who is also guest professor at the College of Europe, Natolin campus in Warsaw. So hello, and it's nice to have you here. So a little bit takes time, because I would like then to go further with the questions to our guests from several perspectives. So hello, and thank you for joining us. So Professor TEOKAREVIČ, I would like to start with the questions regarding the political context and the all-in-all situation. So it's a deep polarized situation, also deepened by the COVID-19 pandemic and necessary regulations. And we have the census lowered to 3%. We have an election boycott, which is indeed not the first time in the Serbian history. So also during the Milosevic regime in the 1990s, oppositional parties called for election boycott, but they never succeeded in that. What is your perception and point of view regarding the election boycott at the moment, and also against the background of the constitutional framework?
Yes, electoral boycott is a very constant topic in the Balkans. So it has not happened only in Serbia many times, but also in Albania, in Montenegro, and in North Macedonia. And it hasn't been very helpful, in fact, in promoting democracy and civil rights across the region. In addition to that, one has to say that there is a constant tendency among Serbian voters to vote for the ruling parties, which is a very strange situation, and it has worked in most cases, but I would not make it a rule because there are two main exceptions in that regard. And these are elections in the year 2000, when Milosevic was ousted, and also 2012, when Serbia got both the president, Nikolic, from the Serbian Progressive Party, and the Serbian government majority in the parliament of the same party. So historically speaking, this is a rule with important exceptions. What seems to be good for the success of the change of the attitude to vote for ruling parties is actually that we need to have an exceptional emergency situation in Serbia, like in 2000 after the war with NATO, or as in 2012, where we, in contrast, had an almost complete disillusionment and disappointment with the Serbian democratic opposition in government since for 12 years almost. Plus, the economic crisis was very hard. And these two factors, I think, contributed to the change of the pattern. So the voters did not vote again for the ruling parties. But in order for this system to continue functioning, actually, it's very important actually to see what is at the basis of the type of governance in Serbia. And this is very important for the moment in which we are speaking. Serbian regime is, among other things, a highly clientelistic regime. So in other words, we have asymmetric relationship between those in power and those who are not. in which practically goods, there is a demand for exchange of goods and services for political support. What is interesting and very important to understand, actually, that in countries like Serbia, so not only in Serbia, the clientelism actually works on the assumption, which is true, that it is good both for very poor people and for very rich people. When it comes to very rich people, say it is good for them actually to make profitable contracts with public state entities. And I could mention a very illustrative example that we heard for the first time about during the Corona crisis, and that is the brother of the incumbent justice minister in the Serbian government, and at the same time, the husband of the justice minister, and the brother of very popular epidemiologist who is still a member of this crisis health team in Serbia. This man with his companies has been able to acquire near 27 million euros in contracts with the state public entities in Serbia during the last 5 years. When it comes to the second group, much larger group of people that function and that oil this clientelistic machine, the poor and very poor people actually, clientelism is good for them because they can demand some simple economic favors, like the distribution of those infamous 100 euros to all adults in Serbia on the eve of elections after the Corona crisis. And much more importantly, the poor people need jobs. And the only employer in Serbia at the moment is practically the state. Or we can say it more correctly, it's Vučić and his people and his subordinates in both public, state and private entities in Serbia. So poor people and unemployed people, there's quite a lot of them, although the official unemployment rate is now below 10%, which is not true at all. They are dependent practically on getting a job, finding a job, and this is where the state or the master, the owner of the state, steps in. This is how the system works.
So it's not traditionally an antagonism in between ruralism and urbanism, but it's just an existential problem. And also, when I follow you, this culture of poverty due to existential problems. And when we take a look at the last developments of the last years, after the regime change, and the fall of the Milosevic regime in 2000, the October 5 was a very symbolic date. And in 2001, it was often discussed that the October 6 did not happen. To what extent that means a regime change has taken place, but not a system change? And to what extent, Professor TEOKAREVIĆ, do you see that as a basis for current developments? Because following you, it appears that there was no democratic government in the first years, but it was indeed until 2008, and then it changed, or 2012 to be exact. How can be that interpreted? Because this means that the current situation is cemented and not due to historical backgrounds, but also to the culture of poverty.
Yes, the so-called October 6th phenomenon, or in other words, getting away with the ancien regime, it had many powerful enemies who, as we see today, have eventually won the battle against the October 6th or against getting away with the ancien regime. Some of the most powerful enemies of this trend or this expectation were the following. First, disunity. First, when we look at the opposition, we have had constant disunity within the opposition, and also the lack of a more or less unified platform for transforming Serbia towards a liberal democracy, and quite a high degree of nationalism within the opposition. Also, we could quote here very poor record of a fight against corruption during the reign of the democratic opposition in Serbia between the years 2000 and 2012. And also inability to find solutions for big questions, the economic crisis and Kosovo. So that all led to the if you want, there's another phenomenon which is interesting and important in my view, and that is as long as the number of the so-called transition losers went up, they turned actually their attention and their preferences towards nationalistic policies. That became, in a way, dominant after the 2012 change of government in Serbia. And that was also followed by negation of war crimes, glorifying those who did the war crimes during the 90s. And also it went along with the worsening of relations with almost all Serbia's neighbors. So this is how actually the October 6th never happened. Unfortunately, the part of the opposition that we could label democratic opposition, it suffers from more or less the same illnesses as the governing party or the governing coalition in Serbia. So that was not a change, that was not a power for change also.
So thank you. My next question goes to ALEKSANDRA VIDANOVIĆ regarding the election boycott. So we have this polarized situation in Serbia, and now the question if the elections will be unaccepted due to too low voter turnout. And when we think about our political education, we have human rights, of course, and hopefully and fortunately, and our civic right to vote, and which is at the same time a civil responsibility. And how can it be legitimized and also explained that people actively refuse to go to the polls?
Thank you, Silvia. Well, as it is our right and responsibility to vote, it's also our right to deny the elections, participation in the elections that we find that are not democratic enough, and that then they don't satisfy, let's say, basic rules of human dignity and safety, because these elections in the times of pandemic are definitely not safe. First and foremost, it is the whole campaign has not been safe, especially these huge numbers of people that are gathering for the rallies, which are not called political, but they are political in itself, and going to the elections which are which don't guarantee your basic health safety protocols is not good. I mean, let's go from this first and basic level. Second thing is that actually these elections are not really a choice. When you go to the elections when you have a choice. What is offered in these elections, it's actually our ruling party and our president choosing his own opposition. You know, that's it sounds funny, but all those who are going out, the parties, that are going out in elections are going to enter the parliament with this minimum 3%. And actually, you announced that Sergej Trifunovic and the movement of free citizens is boycotting. No, they're going out as well. So yes, they're one of the parties that that will go out on the election. So basically, people will choose a very tokenistic opposition, which will sit in the parliament. So we will just see the same faces that we've been seeing, looking at since the 90s. So we have the mother party, mother-lode party of the radicals, and their baby party, which outgrew the mother. So it's a Serbian Progressive Party, which is the ruling party. Then we have the monstrosity from the 90s left over after Milosevic with Socialist Party, which will again be there. So whether they are going to go into this unhealthy marriage again with a progressive party or not, probably they will. Now they're just doing all this bargaining, what they will get. And then we will have the tokenistic opposition, which is the far right, very scary neo-Nazi party. Then we have another far right, which is anti-evolution, anti-abortion, anti-gender rights and everything. Another very exotic party, which will probably get into the parliament. So we will have a circus. We will actually have opposition nominally, but we will have something that crept out of the stone, and in normal democratic society it shouldn't have had the possibility. And so these elections, in my view, and in the view of the huge number of the civil society organizations and people from the civic movements, are not legal and are not right. And what Professor TEOKAREVIĆ was mentioning, like corruption levels. So now we have two very relevant institutions giving reports on the state of human rights and democracy in Serbia. You have Freedom House, which is calling Serbian regime a hybrid democracy. We're not democracy anymore. And our government sends a complaint letter to Freedom House, which is independent organization which did this research, complaining, no, we are really a democracy. You see, we have opposition. You know, that's a very, now it's very ironical. Everything that is happening is highly ironical. And then you have a Council of Europe, Greco Commission on the corruption, on the state of corruption. So out of 17 parameters that they were measuring on the corruption, we are partially compliant with 10, and with 7, absolutely not. So corruption is so deeply inserted in every atom of this society. I mean, from the lowest grassroots levels, not to talk as well, Professor just mentioned, the highly corruption in a very high levels in the state. So I don't know what to say. Nothing really to vote for at this moment. And boycott is the only sane thing that you can do in the moment, not to cut your hand for giving a vote to someone who will just play the state music. So.
And Asha, do you think the boycott has really a chance? Because in the last years, and also the case we can say now, oppositional parties or movements called for boycott, and it never happened that the turnout was too low to accept the election results. And this is the year, as I know, that international observers will not accompany the elections. What is your perspective and expectation, Asha, regarding the results? Will a boycott still lead to too low turnout, or will it just be that the elections will work?
I'm very pessimistic. I'm extremely pessimistic. So this election will work, definitely. And the ruling party will still be a ruling party. It's just a matter of finesse, who will enter and who will pass this census. There are a few questions here, as I see, like, what about the young generation? Younger generation is the most apathetic one. So it's actually, they're the ones that are really looking how to get away from Serbia as soon as possible. And they are not active voters. That's a difference between 90s and now. In the 90s, student organizations and young people led the revolt in a way. So all the protests, 91, 92, 96, 7, 2000, there were young people there. but the revolution ate its kids. So the new kids are probably going to vote because they will be eaten by the dinosaurs. That's the last night promotional video of the ruling party. So if you don't go out, dinosaurs will eat you. They have absolute incredible marketing right now for these elections. I think they're scared of boycott, so that's why it's very passive aggressive. The campaign is really very passive aggressive towards the non-voters or abstentees. About the safety protocols, there is another question here. No, there is no possibility to vote postally or electronically, even though many would argue we all registered our data to get this €100 from the government, so they have all our data. So basically, we're all in one base, so we're voting even if we're not voting. It's not possible to do it. And the last question, I think it was more for the Professor TEOKAREVIĆ, is about clientelism. The whole country is in a way clientelistic, and the whole atmosphere is very neoliberal. Ironically, parties that lead us are progressive and socialist. They have nothing to do with either of the ideologies, but names are just the names. It seems so.
So thank you, Ash. So we'll collect the question at the end of our discussion and also answer them together. And my next question I would like to address to Professor Florian BIEBER. So on the EU level, Serbia, however, appears as a good cooperation partner and is an EU candidate state. And the performance of Vučić seems to appear to be trustful, and also the dialogue among Serbia and Belgrade and Pristina. So Vučić and Hashim Thaçi are in direct contact, and Donald Tusk, as I mentioned before, wished good luck to Aleksandar Vučić, who is with his Progressive Party also member of the European People's Party. And you reacted, Florian, yesterday to that congratulations and good wishes. So I would like to ask you, what is the situation about the EU accession process of Serbia and also the perception of the inner processes in Serbia and also the international importance of that country?
Thanks, Sylvia, for this question. I mean, I think, first of all, I think the enthusiasm in the European Union towards Vučić has waned in comparison to a few years ago. He didn't get a photo op with Angela Merkel in Berlin like he did last time when he was elected president. It was exactly a week before the elections that he met with Angela Merkel and with Putin. This time he got Lavrov and Tusk, so it's a little bit more, maybe it's the second-rate endorsement in the European Union. I think there's a rift with him, especially because he's been pushing the border changes regarding to Kosovo, which has been a position which has been endorsed by the United States, the Trump administration, particularly the previous now scandal author Bolton, national security advisor. But this still seems to be the American position. But this is not the position of Germany. So Germany has been for the long time very favorably disposed towards Vučić, and I think this has been a rupture in a certain way in that relationship over the last 2 years. So it's not unconditional support, which we used to have, but yes, the European People's Party, I mean, it's a party which has been supporting and has as one of its members an autocrat, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and has been unfortunately not sufficiently critical towards authoritarian-minded member parties, and thus it's no surprise that also the position towards Vučić is rather uncritical. It's disappointing of Tusk, but he's been making similar statements about his describing Vučić the most Serb of all Serbs 2 years ago, when he was still an EU official, which really makes everybody cringe in Serbia considering his personal history in the 1990s. I mean, you cannot say that without being ignoring his role in the Radical Party, an extreme nationalist party involved in paramilitary activities and war crimes. You cannot say that without showing some degree of disrespect to recent history. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of criticism, but there's also not the kind of unconditional support. I think the problem which we're seeing is that it's really only currently of the major parties the ruling SNS and the SPS, which have international kind of affiliations. I mean, all of the opposition parties are not clearly affiliated or strongly affiliated with European party families. The Democratic Party is, but it's kind of now very much subsumed in the boycotting group of parties. It's not very strong anymore. There are, of course, the far-right parties, from radicals to Dveri. There are parties which are otherwise not affiliated. They haven't been building European contacts. And I think this is one of the big weaknesses of the opposition in Serbia, besides its internal fragmentation and lack of ideological coherence. It's its lack of international outreach. It's been very, in a certain way, very much internally centered. And that, of course, becomes a boomerang in these situations. When we have boycotts as well, and I think this is important to kind of add to the previous discussion, is that generally speaking, this is going to be the worst of all boycotts. And I'm reminded of the 97 boycotts in Serbia when most of the opposition boycotted, but then some participated. That back then it was Vuk Drašković, who's now running, I believe, on together with the Progressive Party as a minor add-on. That's kind of his career of over the last 25 years. But he legitimized the elections in 97, and now again we have too many opposition parties participating to fundamentally undermine the elections. And the only one to which you can really undermine the elections is internationally, because domestically there's a polarization. Either people believe the regime or are clientelistically linked to it, or they're against it. But it's very much about the international signal. And I think that's not going to succeed because, first of all, international actors have been generally very skeptical about boycotts. Now we can discuss whether that's justified or not, but in previous boycotts, they've been usually kind of talking about constructive dialogue, and the framing has been always about, this is about an issue between government and opposition, not about democracy. This has been one of the big weaknesses of international responses. This happened in North Macedonia, this happened in Montenegro, in Albania, and I don't think it's going to be very different in Serbia. So I think the boycott cannot achieve what it seeks to achieve in terms of getting international attention, especially because parts of the opposition are participating and those who are boycotting don't have the international kind of allies to convince them to say this is a serious problem. You cannot work with Vučić for resolving any problems, because that's not what he's in business in. He's in the business of making problems and not resolving them. But I think this is one of the structural weaknesses. In that sense, I think maybe the failure of the opposition to really undermine the legitimacy of the elections, my prediction, is something which will lead to a learning process of what it has to do different. So just like 97 was learning for 2000, maybe this election in 2020 is learning for the next step of how to effectively confront the government. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
My microphone, sorry, my microphone just to listen to you. So what you in fact also explained was the situation that we have, the paradoxical situation in Serbia, that stabilocracy and the stabilocrat is leading Serbia to European Union. And what is the stabilocracy about? It's the policy and the strategy of pretending that there is security and stability, while in fact checks and balances are weakened, and the situation is everything else but liberal democratic. And regarding Serbia now, we have this contradiction, and that on the one hand, it's a success story. It's a new candidate, and on the European level, and on the other hand, the internal divisions and struggles. And Florian, my question to you: when there is this situation that you mentioned that oppositional parties do not have any allies, how can that be realized? Because we have the situation that the opposition is marginalized in public, in media, in public space. And what is the way out? Because when we refer again to the year 2000, you mentioned the elections and the protests of 96 and 7, where the lessons learned for the 2000 developments. So what can be now be the factors for learning for the upcoming developments? Because there are also experts who have the prognosis that the current government will end in 2020. I don't know against which background, but these also are the prognoses that it is not eternal, but just a question of time. At the other hand, when structures are stabilized through institutions, in a way, eternity can, in a way, be also perceived.
Well, first of all, nothing lasts forever. Although if you're in Montenegro, that for not forever can look very long lasting. And I think the Vučić government is aiming for a Đukanović scenario of staying in power. And I think the problem is that in the European Union itself, there isn't the willingness to use all the mechanisms available. So, for example, the accession process has not made much advances in recent years. I mean, the chapters are open, but they're not really closed. Nobody talks about 2025 anymore. So the enlargement process for Serbia is stagnating. But the EU and the Commission is not willing to use the emergency brake. That is, for example, the imbalance clause, which says the rule of law is in such a discrepancy to other areas that we cannot negotiate with Serbia. And I think the reason why the EU is worried is that Vučić constantly tells them, if you don't dance with us, we go and ask our friend China, Russia, Turkey to dance with us, and they are just as attractive as you are. And this is what, you know, Vučić said during the pandemic. And what is the response of the European Union? It says, no, we give you better aid, we give you more aid. So in a certain way, they're playing the game, they're in a certain way falling for a trap, because China, Russia, Turkey are not offering anything to the citizens beyond a few masks and credits which have to be paid back. And so the EU is in a certain way entrapped by Serbia. So it can only change if they realize that this is that they have to have a different approach, clearer language. I mean, one of the big things which happened after '97 with Milosevic was that the international community realized that Milosevic was not the guarantor of stability in the Balkans. This is how it was perceived. Felipe González went there to negotiate between opposition and Milosevic in '97. And only the Kosovo War made the realization clear that Milosevic is not a partner, is not bringing stability. Now, I don't hope and believe in a likelihood of an armed conflict, but some kind of clear realization has to occur in the international community, as far as there's a community, that Vučić is not a partner for them.
Thank you. My next question goes to Alexandra, to Asha. We have the situation of the permanent waiting room regarding the accession. And you mentioned young people who flee the country. So approximately there are 60,000 people who leave Serbia per year. And how is it trustful for people living in Serbia that after a democratic party government, after the year 2000, the former opponents, or now again intensified opponents, are leading the country to the European Union? So what is the atmosphere regarding a situation that an autocrat regime is leading the country to the European Union, and also the perceptions of the European Union itself, because it also seems after nearly 20 years, it lost in a way its glance, if it might be said.
This is a very complex question. I belong to these generations that lead to the changes, and I was on the streets during these 90s and 2000, and I said it before, I think the revolution ate its children, because the leaders of 90s revolutions, let's say, are now very structurally part of the government in different ways, or political parties. So they are there. So we were in our 20s, now we are in our 40s or 50s and actually, if I may use the term gentrification, because what is happening from the wild Serbia, which had the passion and the energy and the mood, and it was not perfect, but it was moving. It was gentrified in every way. So like our Belgrade is now no more parks, only stone and modern structures. So we also became this stone and modern structures. Nowadays, young people have very little energy and willingness to become the change that is needed. From what I know, and I've been working with some young people, with lots of young people actually, their wish is just to be the same as in Europe. So it's and to go to Europe and to be Europe, but not necessarily getting politically engaged to become this part of the Europe. They're just looking for jobs. So they are even willing to, do the waitressing in Germany rather than stay here and make changes. I know few young people who studied medicine and decided to go to Germany just to be nurses without, even after 7 years of studying medicine, they accepted a lower paid job just to leave. So this is very scary. I don't know where this energy can come out from. I don't know what needs to happen. That's a very good and legitimate question. I hope we don't need a war in order to create this kind of also to alert outside that we need help. But what is happening right now, I don't know which kind of electrical shock is needed for the civil society, which is also totally pacified and dealing with some very superficial things. Organizations, big civil society organizations, which were very political in its actions in the past, just died out or just became very, very pacified and very obedient. So I really don't know what's going on there, because they got the EU funds and then they have to play the EU role. Also, foreign embassies are not helping a lot. Then when you see the US ambassador dining and whining with the government all the time, it doesn't put much faith in anything that the US can and will do, even though USAID was supporting civil sector before. But then you have half of the civil sector that works for USAID projects sitting in this government, including our prime minister. I mean, so it's not really putting faith. And our president supporting President Trump, which is also devastating. That's not giving a good signal to young people. I went out of the question that you asked, but honestly, I have no answer. I have no good answer. Maybe somebody else from the speakers has a good answer to this question.
Regarding youth, Asha, thank you. I would like to include this question from a participant, from Julius Leiter, who posed the question if youth organizations and youth participation is supported and funded. And of course, this also leads to the situation of the 1990s, because we know that during the 1990s, open society and USAID could help oppositional developments and youth. And what is the situation? Because it really fits now to what you said. I would like to include this spontaneously.
Youth organization, there is a very supportive Ministry of Youth, which is giving lots of grants, especially to the mysterious youth organizations that are leading and inviting people in the middle of pandemic to burn torches on the buildings and invite people to protest against the hunger strikers, for example. I'm being very ironical, but there are lots of state-funded youth organizations. Lots of, and even some very decent youth organizations, since they lack the funds they have, they accept the funds from the ministry and from the government, and are very passive. They are dealing with superficial things. That's what I was saying. They are not dealing with crucial, important issues, and they are not getting politicized. They are avoiding politics, anything that smells like politics. That's my impression. So they deal with social entrepreneurship, care for elderly, lots of nice environment, lots of important things, but not anything that would be crucial. There are EU funds. They're mainly for the youth exchanges and cross-border exchanges. Also very relevant, very important, and very hard to access if you are not a well-structured organization with big budget and expertise to apply for EU funds. Other donors, there are very few. I work a lot and mostly, with the Palme Center, Olof Palme Center, which supports social democratic initiatives and trade unions. That's main part of my job, but it's the same situation with it. There are not too many civil society organizations with the potential to make any constructive changes. That's my opinion. Yeah.
Thank you, Asha. I would like to pose my next question to Professor TEOKAREVIĆ, because we have the situation of depopulation, if we may say that, many people leaving the country, and also prognosis and interpretations to what extent this might influence the political culture in the future. And I would like, in a way, it may sound a little bit provoking, Professor TEOKAREVIČ, to what extent do you see also the current development, so brain drain and emigration, getting out, exit. What do you see? Which influence might it have for the future? Because democracy and demography are interlinked, really strongly interlinked.
High levels of emigration have, of course, detrimental effects on all spheres, on economy, on society, and on politics also. And as has been debated during the last months, very much in the literature and in media, you see practically the tendency in post-communist societies, including Serbia, that the main possible potential forces for liberal democracy have been actually exited, have been emigrating. And this reduces the core part of society, actually, that could be a motor of change. And in this respect, Serbia is not different than the others. Bulgaria will have a much more dramatic population decline. So this is a very dangerous trend. But if I may add now, because we are probably at the end of the conversation, I would like to add two brief things. One is, I believe all our listeners actually are knowledgeable because they are interested in participating in this debate. They're quite knowledgeable about Serbia. But let me stress two things. One is the level of domination of Vučić and his party in Serbia. It is an extraordinary level. So with the last electoral results of 48% win for the Parliament of Serbia, to which one might add 11% of his partner, Socialist Party of Serbia, he practically runs the country alone. Fueling this has been fueled by the cult of personality that has been built. So he practically out beyond any institution that formally still exists in Serbia. He controls both parliaments in Serbia and both governments of Serbia and of Vojvodina. And out of 159 municipalities, there are only 3 where his party is not in control. 1 in Belgrade, but that's one of 17 municipalities in Belgrade, and 2 in provinces in Šabac and in Paraćin. He controls practically all media except for a couple of TV stations, 2 weeklies, and 1 daily, and a couple of websites. So all this with less than 50% majority in the assembly. So what are the the prospects after these elections? Everybody's guessing now how high the boycott will be, how successful. I guess it's going to be certainly, so the turnout is going to be certainly less than 50%, but not less than 40%, which is not enough. One comparing example, exactly a year ago, there were local elections in Albania, and we have not said that now. We have on the same date, in 3 days, we have also local elections in Serbia. The turnout there was only 21%. So the opposition was extremely successful actually in boycotting these elections. Nothing happened. And the EU and other powerful international actors practically, turned a blind eye. They issued some recommendations, some criticism, but they practically legitimized these elections in Albania. If that was done with 21%, what can we expect with 40+% that I predict in Serbia? I'll stop here. I don't want to mention the second thing. Thank you.
We have time. We have time. Thank you. We have time. Jovan,
okay. Can I add something? One more.
Please, we have time.
Yes, that I think it's very important. So Florian was speaking about that. I will just want to continue the story. What the Serbian democratic opposition hasn't been successful at is the internationalization of the democratic crisis in Serbia. One thing that its counterpart, the Macedonian democratic opposition, actually was successful at 5 years ago. And that is a huge difference. So in that year, in Macedonia, actually, the EU reacted positively and sent an envoy, and practically he wrote this famous Pribe report. And practically what was introduced was a real effective mediation between the government and the opposition. What we had in Serbia during the last part of the last year is actually some kind of a substitute of real mediation between the two sides. And I'm sure that whatever the results and the turnout on Sunday will be, the result will be the same as in Albania in June 2019. There will be some criticism and some recommendations, but practically from the international point of view, these fraud elections will be considered not only legit in harmony with the law, but also to a high degree as legitimate. And that will make the things in Serbia much worse. Things might not change with the coming post-corona economic crisis in autumn or in winter. So what has prevailed in this discussion is actually a very high degree of pessimism that we all share, it seems, and it is actually it actually describes Serbia very well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. TEOKAREVIĆ. There was a question by one participant regarding clientelism, which would also fit to your explanations. And it's again from Julio Slaita, who asked, can you still call it clientelism if it excludes most parts of the population? So I can put it just to so it's not working as I thought. But can you call it still in clientelism if most parts of the population is included by that? So it's a good, interesting question. So when ends clientelism and where does it start?
Yeah, it's a proper question. Yes. It involves big parts of the population, but mostly, as I said, those who are poor and in search of jobs on one side, and those who are very rich and well connected with the governing people. So I think, yes, this description of Serbia, of the governance in Serbia, is still actually good for that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And my next question goes to Florian, Professor Florian BIEBER. You mentioned previously. You mentioned that it's not realized on European level the inner political processes, and also Jovan TEOKAREVIĆ also mentioned the democratic crisis. And all in all, we could we could maybe also in a provoking way, we could say we do not have at the moment Corona crisis, but also a democracy crisis, which started before the Corona crisis and is now increasing due to these factors. And on the European level, which allies, apart from the European People's Party, the Serbian government can expect. And here I would also like to include also the question on why is the EPP actually supporting I'm not trying because it's a longer question and it should be seen now. No. So why the European People's Party, Florian, is including, and then what is the relationship also in that context with the Polish peace government and the European government in Hungary, which you also mentioned in your statement regarding the wishes to Alexander Vučić.
I want to pick up on, use that to also pick up on something which Jovan said, the difference to the Macedonian situation a few years ago. I mean, I think one thing what's happened is that in Macedonia, North Macedonia, back then still Macedonia, in 2016, there was a clear opposition party, which was part of the Socialist member party family. So it had allies in Europe and was able to mobilize them, and it was able to mobilize citizens. And that all made it a lot easier for the European Union to become active. None of this is currently in place in Serbia. Also, I think this is important to mention, who is the commissioner in charge of enlargement? 4 years ago, it was Johannes Hahn, who was the Austrian commissioner who became involved. Who is the commissioner now? It's the Hungarian commissioner who is a close loyalist of Viktor Orban. So I think, I don't know what happened, but it's to me, it's an interesting coincidence. And I was part of a discussion yesterday where this was pointed out by some of the speakers about Hungarians' influence in the Western Balkans, that Viktor Orban visits President Vučić, and a few days later, the Commissioner for Enlargement announces that there will be no progress reports, no reports of the Commission for the Western Balkans until the fall. Let's just say it's very convenient for the government of Serbia not to have a critical report about the lack of progress in EU enlargement come out a few days or weeks before the elections. So, it's very clear that the Orban government has been supporting the government of Aleksandar Vučić. It's been supporting the government of Nikola Gruevski, and it has their inside man in the European Commission to help them. And I think we have to be aware of this particular risk. The problem is, why does the EPP support it? I mean, the problem is the EPP is, of course, a heterogeneous group of actors. Orban likes to produce his, people who think and rule similarly to him. He's been promoting it in Macedonia. He's promoting it currently in Slovenia with Janez Janša, who is also copying a combination of Orban and Trumpist rhetoric in his attacks on the media and the opposition. And he's doing it in the case of Serbia. So Orban has an interest. Also, he wants these kind of governments in the European Union because it strengthens his bargaining tool within the EU. The motivation is more tricky when it comes to conservative parties elsewhere in Europe, especially the German CDU or the ÖVP in Austria, where I'm not entirely sure what the motivation is. With Hungary, it's clear these are votes in the European Parliament. They translate into commissioners, they translate into majorities in the Parliament. I'm never sure what it is with the SNS or other parties. I think it is, of course, about power. It's, many European party families are about power, and we shouldn't exclude the socialists from this critique because they've been equally uncritical when it comes to Edi Rama in Albania or Milo Đukanović in Montenegro. So it's not in a certain way only one party family. But I think what we're seeing is that what people said 10 years ago, the European party families will, quote unquote, Europeanize these parties, will make them more European, more in a certain way in line with larger European dynamics. It's in fact the opposite. I think these autocrats have undermined these parties and have, in a certain way, it's the, what I call often, it's, the old metaphor of the tail wagging the dog, not the other way around. And that's what we're seeing, is that these autocrats are, kind of wagging the dog of European party families and really undermining them. But unfortunately, we don't, because basically a voter in Germany will not like if the CDU cooperates with the far-right AfD, and they will punish the party if it wants to do that. But if the same party cooperates with the Fidesz, which is ideologically no different from the AfD in Germany, then this is forgiven because nobody pays attention. So the German voter doesn't pay attention, the Austrian voter doesn't pay attention to who the allies are in Macedonia and Serbia. And I think this allows a much more pragmatic power politics game rather than one based on values and norms. We don't hear you.
So it's always the intention not to disturb, but then... thank you, Florian. I would like to include the question of Christina Giesler, because it also fits to what you mentioned, how the Serbian election observed by the neighboring countries, and what impact can it have on neighborhood.
Well, I would say that it's showing what is possible in terms of what we've heard earlier, the complete sidelining of opposition, media control, clientelism, kind of in this consolidation and holding election in this context. If you get away with it, then this is certainly a very useful lesson for those who like to govern in similar ways. It shows them what they can't do. So in that sense, I think it's a negative signal. We don't have immediate candidates. I mean, Milo Djukanovic is ruling similarly, and he's been doing it for a long time, and that's not going to change because of what he's learned. He's teaching Vucic, he's not learning from Vucic particularly, but it certainly kind of sets a pattern for the region, which is rather negative and kind of shows, it's like pushing the boundaries. I mean, Orban has been professionalizing this, is pushing the red lines, crossing them to see as much as possible how much he can get away with. And this is what Vucic is doing with these elections now. And if there's no pushback, at least internationally, then I worry that it will be encouraging for others.
So we have also, we have a completely different situation than in the 0 years, 2000 years, when on the European Union level, the Serbian government under the Democratic Party was put much more under pressure. And Florian, you mentioned due to the geopolitical influence by China and Russia, it's now the need to be more active. And what is your recommendation, Florian? You mentioned that oppositional parties should search for allies, and at the same time there should be the sensitivity and perception that new relationships should be necessary, but also provoking. Wouldn't that destabilize the current situation?
I mean, I would say that first things have to get worse before they get better, unfortunately. And I'm not saying this because I wish it, but it seems the kind of breaking point also where citizens are, because I mean, in a certain way, as Jovan has said, this is a clientelistic system. Lots of people are tied to the system. They have to vote for the ruling party because they might lose their job. They have to deliver votes. These systems only break if people are willing to take a high risk to vote against it. Otherwise, there's a high price they pay. They have to have a certain degree of certainty that their rebelling against the system will be successful, because if they lose, they pay a price for it, a personal price, because they're clientelistically linked to the government, or they have to feel like they have nothing to lose. None of this has been reached at this point. And so this makes this kind of breakthrough a lot more difficult. But I think, the last point, and I mean, is also that, the opposition is ideologically so heterogeneous. You have Dveri, which is basically not just an extreme nationalist, but has far right. Talks about population exchange. I mean, it's copies. Combines far right Serbian nationalism with the kind of AfD. FPÖ, far-right politics of Europe, and they are together with liberals and with then the kind of conservatives who are kind of ambiguous. It's very hard with this kind of hodgepodge of ideas. They're not pro-European. Many of them are anti-European in many ways. Their ideas are very contradictory, so it's very easy for the government to attack them. And of course, the government is also everything. Vučić is also both, appeals to fascists and to pro-Europeans in a whole spectrum. And the opposition does the same. So the question is, why vote for the bad copy if we can get the original who covers everything? And so I think it's very hard for the opposition to work if it doesn't have a clear alternative. What does it offer? Does it offer 10 Vučićes to replace one Vučić? I mean, 10 little guys who are very similar in personality, in ideas than he is. Why should you support that? And I think this is the problem. There isn't a clear, in a certain way, offer on the table, which really suggests that. And of course, it's very hard because the European Union doesn't make it easy. In 2000, you could say, we want not wars, we don't want a kind of isolation, we don't want sanctions, we don't want we want a European future of Serbia. Now this is what Vučić is saying. So how can you want a more European future for Serbia? So this is, I think, very difficult, but it's certainly one of the structural weaknesses of the current power constellation.
Thank you. I would like to lead this question to Aleksandra. So what to do if one Vučić or as Florian mentioned, or 10 ones? So it's also a question regarding civil society activities.
I believe that civil society would like to wait it out a bit because, I mean, one Vučić is quite enough. So I don't know what we would be able, whether we would be able to deal with 1.5 Vučić. And already lots of the other politicians are little clones of Vučić by their rhetorics and behavior. So, and also just go back for a second to the neighboring countries. We also have elections incoming in Croatia and Macedonia, and we will see actually what the impact is. So they dared as well in the midst of pandemic to play the same card. So I'm very curious to see what's going on there. So I already am following a bit the mess that is being created, and stronger right-wing rhetorics and politics of xenophobia, virusophobia. It all also stimulated this general fear where it's very easy to manipulate with people who are in panic. I believe that not only 21st we won't bring many changes, but I believe that possibly 27th and 28th, the Vidovdan thing, which somebody smartly called it today COVID-dan, so not Vidovdan, will bring some changes with the talks of Vučić and Tači about Kosovo. So I believe that might be very interesting because they're going to Washington to talk about Kosovo. So for me, I'm expecting some news which might shake this Dead Sea that we currently have, where we're all kind of trying to swim, but we can't even sink. That's really, it is I believe, for me, the good analogy, because you can't properly swim in this sea, but you can't even properly sink. So you're just there floating and waiting for something to happen. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And next question I would like to pose to Jovan TEOKAREVIĆ. Would you expect after these elections from the inner point of view of Serbia regarding the EU accession process, and then what and the legitimacy of the new government regarding finally the EU accession process?
It's going to be more of the same, I think. So one step forward, 2 steps back, a very long way ahead of us in uncertain future. It's nothing different actually from than what we have had. The EU is also inconsistent, as Florian was saying, in this, because, for instance, they at the end of March, on March the 30th, they decided to open negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania, and until now, this was expected or is expecting to happen in June. There is no date for the start of these accession negotiations. By and large, we can say the same thing is happening about 2 methods, 2 ways of going towards EU membership. The two states, Montenegro and Serbia, which have been negotiating for several years now, have not actually chosen the model, the old one or the new one proposed by the European Commission earlier in the year. So we have so many unknown things, and I think if the EU enlargement has been sidelined and marginalized during the last 10 or 12 years, the situation is not going to change. It might get actually even worse now after this pandemic, and it's going to be even further on the margins of interest of the EU. So not a big change, I would say.
Thank you. And to Florian Bieber, I would like now last round. I would like to start with Florian Bieber. What effect does it have that from the geopolitical point of view that Serbia is surrounded by NATO members and NATO accession and membership is also kind of, perceived at least, as a kind of guarantee for EU accession. And of course, a NATO accession of Serbia, first of all, after 1999, does not seem to be possible.
Well, I think while there's a link between NATO and EU accession, it's not a must. And I think I would be very skeptical that any country has to join NATO to join the European Union. The countries who've joined NATO in recent years have done so because they see it as a security provision. I don't think for Serbia it's on the agenda. I mean, so in that sense, I think EU accession is not going to fail because of lack of NATO membership. I mean, I think that's not what is going to jeopardize Serbia's NATO EU accession process. I think Serbia has been quite clear on that it doesn't want to join NATO. In that sense, it's also surrounded by NATO member states in many ways. So one has to also be careful not to in a certain way overplay the kind of argument of the Russian threat and the Russian involvement. I mean, you can't fly a Russian plane to Serbia without crossing NATO airspace these days. So, I mean, there's a limit of what that role can do in a security dimension. But I think one thing is interesting is if you look at the number of Serbian citizens who are in favor of joining NATO, that number has declined dramatically over the last 10 years. I mean, in the early 2010s, there was not a majority, it never was, but there was a much larger number of people in Serbia in favor of NATO membership than there are today. And that's very ironic because it's not that NATO did anything against Serbia in the meantime, because the big issue was 1999. You would expect that more time passes, it would become less important. But the opposite has happened. It's the same thing when you ask, do Serbs care about Kosovo? A lot fewer Serbs cared about Kosovo 10 years ago than they do now, which to me suggests that this is not an accident. This is the government constantly talking about NATO threat. If you look at Informer and all the media, constantly talking about NATO being hostile, aggressive. You have a Minister of Defense who's making his main kind of political capital out of bashing NATO and the West. And at the same time also talking about Kosovo. So I think you have to look a lot about how the government is manufacturing public opinion and what that tells us about what it intends to do. So it's not preparing the ground for Kosovo. It's certainly not preparing the ground for closer, not membership, but alliance or cooperation with NATO. And all of that is in a certain way deliberately done by the government through its, in a certain way, public relations and media control. We don't hear you.
Thank you, Florian. I'm just looking, we do not have several questions, and I would like to finalize with the last questions, which is in a way is summarizing. So we have brought pessimism in 90 minutes collected, but we have the context of post-corona, global crisis situation, and threatening liberal democracy. And from the personal point of view, kind of provoking question, what do you personally expect after Sunday, on coming Monday? So I would like to start with you, Florian, and go then to Asha and Jovan TEOKAREVIĆ.
I mean, I think I've been clear saying that things will not get better, and I fear that the elections will confirm the absolute dominance. And I would also agree with Aleksandra's point that the regime is picking his opposition rather than the other way around. So I expect things to get worse in the coming months. Stagnation with the EU, internal kind of frustration. That can be a productive dimension in developing new ideas and new energy of how to tackle this kind of embedded, entrenched regime. But I don't see a change soon. I don't believe anything will happen on Vidov or Covidan beyond a nice photo and a few tweets, and that will all disappear, like the Israeli-Palestinian peace plan and the North Korean rapprochement. All of this is just smokes and mirrors.
And Asha, what are you expecting?
I was hoping for this Covidan to bring some change, because the elections definitely won't, and things will get worse before they get better. I absolutely agree. They will get much, much worse, I'm afraid. So, I mean, if we had some shreds of dignity and democracy now, I think we will have to fight really hard to keep them. I'm really very, very pessimistic, unfortunately. I kind of lost faith in the civil society, and the only faith I potentially have is in these grassroots civic movements like NADJIVAN Beograd, the local front, Association of Tenants in Niš. So it's on the local level. Hopefully by 2022, they will get stronger enough, or more people will recognize the potential. Otherwise, I'm very scared to say, yeah, not a good week in front of us.
And Jovan TEOKAREVIĆ, what is your personal expectation?
I share the pessimistic view of both of our participants, and actually think that more than other things, external influence or something else, actually the economic situation might be the key to what we are speaking about, not perhaps to the change. And in that respect, I'm, how to say, not brave enough to say that the drive for change could actually come only with the worsening of the economic situation. And I don't wish that for my country and for the society. And we are not there at this moment, in fact, because despite mountains of lies that we have been hearing from Vučić about economic successes, the economic situation is better to some extent now than several years ago in many ways. And it's not going actually because we have, and we shall have actually, quite high level of foreign investment, heavily subsidized by Vučić's budget. We won't have a dramatic fall of economic activity, especially because Serbia does not depend on money from tourism as some other Southeast European countries and other countries in Europe depend. So it's going to be muddling through the economic crisis, and this reduces the chances for revolt in Serbia. All those who are unsatisfied or angered by the type of regime they live in, and I am there, and if they're younger than me, they will find actually liberal democracy somewhere else, not in Serbia.
So many thanks for your prospects and prospects to liberal democracy and what we can expect from the elections coming Sunday. At that point, I would like to thank all our guests for this deep insight and sound analysis. thank you, Florian, thank you, Asha, and thank you, Jovan, for participating and joining us here. And
Thank you.
At the same time, I would like to lead the attention to the coming panel discussion on the election in Croatia. It will take place also online as a live stream panel discussion on the 2nd of July, because the Croatian parliamentary elections will take place on Sunday, the 5th of July. And we will spread more information in cooperation with the Political Academy and the Karl-Renner-Institut. So just follow our website and also social media input and information. And all to our all viewers, thank you for watching and following. There is not